Our old buddy Josh Pate had a nice little take on our Clemson Tigers in one of his most recent episodes of the College Football Show with Josh Pate. I'm sure everybody on here already knows who Josh Pate is, but if you don't know, obviously he's a college football personality for 247 Sports. Has a great college football show here on YouTube that he does each and every week, multiple times. And does a lot of good content. But obviously, in one of his recent episodes, Jordan, he had some comments about Clemson's future and how, in his opinion, he's not so sure which direction the Clemson football program is heading. And some of the reasons that he stated in his opinion of why he feels like Clemson may be trending in the wrong direction was none other than the 2025 recruiting class. This past recruiting class is the worst ranked class since 2010. So there is something to be said about that. He also went on to say that Clemson isn't close. They're not close to Texas. They're not close to Ohio State. They're not close to the leaders of the SEC, which would obviously be Georgia, Alabama, LSU, those type of programs. So, Jordan, I'm sure you heard what Josh Pate had to say. What were your thoughts on kind of what he said? And he, to his credit, he did say he's not set in stone on this, but it was just how he feels currently at this moment about the Clemson football program going forward. He did mention that 2025 could be a really good year for Clemson.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely, took him what he said. And obviously, initially, the fan in me was kind of like a little bit taken aback. But I do think he did make some quality points. Obviously, we've talked about this 2025 recruiting class and how they did not meet the standard and they did not meet where they wanted to be. And not even and I'm not even talking about just where they landed in as far as the rankings was concerned. It just in terms of the quality of player, the guys that they had on the board, the guys that they had committed that they weren't able to hold on to, that was not something that that was obviously a very, very big disappointment and a failure.
Yes.
And so, Clemson can't afford to have classes like this yearly. And I think that's something that I think pretty much anybody will agree. Like you're not going to be able to do that. I think there were issues with Josh's kind of he kind of neglected the fact that Clemson only signed 15 players. Obviously, that does play a big role especially in the 247 Sports ranking where volume is weighted more than say on three. And so it was kind of it was a little disingenuous, but I think the main point, I think there was some truth there. And so my thing is, I don't think that Clemson is going to fall off a cliff after next season. Like I that's not where I am, and I especially feel a lot more confident with what Clemson has done addressing needs this cycle. That Clemson would, if there was need, there was needs after next year, which there will be, that they are willing to address them in more ways than just the high school recruiting class.
Yes.
And I think they're off to a better start and in a better position to hold on to their commits this go around. I feel like they are going to make it a effort not to have as many decommits as you did in 2025 and the caliber of decommit that you had. I think the volume was kind of neglected because when you take into account the player average, Clemson was 17th nationally, which still isn't great. It's not great by Clemson standards, but it does put into perspective that the quality of player that they're bringing in wasn't necessarily that far down. But so I think, like I said, you're not going to be able to afford to recruit this way and have this kind of class every single cycle. But I definitely don't think that's going to happen. And I think that Clemson is in a position where they will, especially now, that they will address whatever needs come next year. And I think they're going to have a better recruiting class in 2026 than they did in 2025. I think they have shifted. I think the 2025 class was a little bit of a learning curve. It was a little bit different because, you just had schools come in and swoop and offer your guys a lot more money than you were willing to pay for them.
Yeah.
And, that it just is what it is. And so, especially if you combine that with a really successful season, I do think it's pivotal that Clemson, has the kind of season that we, at least close to the kind of season that we think they can have. Um, and I think that will also help a ton in terms of your recruiting efforts. You just got to win games, and
Yeah.
you just this past season, while you took some steps forward in a lot of ways, I mean, you got embarrassed on national television in your first game. You got embarrassed at home. You lost to your rival, and so when you compound those things with a class that's not very big, and you don't, there are other schools that are willing to pool their NIL money to come and take it. That's a recipe for having your guys poached, and that's something that Clemson has had to deal with, even in the previous cycles, and they were better. They were just more fortunate at holding on to those kids than they were this cycle. So I think Josh has kind of drawn the ire of the fan base a little bit, and I definitely understand a little bit what he's saying. Why the fan base feels the way they do, but I do think there is some valid points in there, because especially if I were an outsider and I saw Clemson with the 26th recruiting class, you're going to make conclusions you just off the jump without looking into it. That's the nature of the sport, and so I understand completely from that standpoint, but I do think it's a lot more nuanced than, they had the 26th class, and so that means that they're falling off a cliff. I don't see it that way, and we'll just have to see, because I think there are a lot of I think this is a better class than the rankings will give them credit for. I'm not necessarily worried about one class that looks like this, but if you start to make it 2, 3, and you see the 2023 and 2024 classes cycle out, now we're talking about a significant dip in talent from where you were, where you are now, and where you've been. So, Josh is usually I think Josh is more fair to Clemson than people think, but I do think there was some nuance that he left out when he was talking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I don't agree with his premise on Clemson football as a program moving forward.
Yeah.
I vehemently disagree with his sentiments on Clemson moving forward. However, to say that he's wrong about the 2025 class is silly, right? It's the 2025 class was unacceptable. And yes, it was a small class, and we only signed 15 guys. Ultimately, I think ended up 28th overall in the country. But even with the smaller class, we've had smaller class in the past and finished much higher than that. So, although that is something to consider when looking at the overall ranking, it was still a subpar class from Clemson standards. Now, with that said, I don't think it's like the end of Clemson football, and now they're going to spiral down to a 6-6, 5-7 football team because one recruiting class just didn't go our way. Now, to your point, you can't have another recruiting class like this. This has to be an anomaly, because if this trend continues, you will be a 6-6, 5-7 type of team, quick, fast, and in a hurry in today's college football, right? But again, I do think ultimately 2025 being ranked 28th overall will ultimately end up being an anomaly for Clemson. Typically, Clemson is in the 9 to 15 range, if you will. If you average it out over, the last 15, 16, 17 seasons, Clemson is anywhere from, 15 to 9th. Yeah, we had a couple years there in 2020 and 2021 where we finished 3-5. But outside of those 2 years, we've never cracked the top 5. And we've never been there consistently. We've always been, just outside the top 10 or right inside the top 10, somewhere within 2 or 3 rankings of that. So got to get back to that in 2026. I think we will. And to your point about the transfer portal, Dabo has now proven to everyone that he is willing, if there's a hole, he's willing to go grab that starter if need be, i.e. Will Helt, right? He's willing to go grab a depth piece for the wide receiver room, right? He's willing to do these things in order to add to a roster. So to your point, if next season somehow there's a hole here, hole here, hole here, hole there, I believe he will go out and get the best possible player that Clemson can land in order to fill that spot. So that's another reason that I don't agree with his long-term projection of Clemson football. I think Dabo Swinney has pivoted when it comes to his coaching staff, and coaching truly matters in this sport more than people are willing to admit. Yes, it's about talent acquisition, and it's about identifying and acquiring high school talent and developing them. But it's about coaching. It's about developing those players when they're on your roster. It's about the X's and O's. It's about in-game adjustment. It's about setting your players up for success. You can have the most talented roster, and if you got a terrible coach, he's not going to do much with it, right? So I think the pivot's been made there. So I understand what Josh Pate was saying, and from an outside perspective, like you were saying, I get that people are still leery of Clemson football. I understand that from an outside perspective. I have full confidence as a Clemson fan that we have started to turn that corner and are heading back in the right direction. But I fully get people from the outside still questioning Clemson football. And all you got to do in 2025 is go out there and win, because ultimately 2024 was a big improvement, specifically on the offensive side of the ball. But they can still point to, you lost to the only 3 SEC teams you played. You got embarrassed in week 1. You lost to your rival. And then you lost in the college football playoff to another SEC team in Texas. So the only 3 SEC teams you played, you lost. And guess what? For the second year in a row, you lost 4 games. So there are arguments to be made to be like, well, how much of an improvement was 2024 for Clemson? Yeah, you got to the ACC championship game and won and went to the playoffs, but you still lost 4 games, right? So there is criticism out there. I don't agree with it because I think Clemson, although they still lost 4 games, there was a lot more improvement, and they were a far different team than the 2023 version. And if you watch them, you would know that. But there's valid criticism out there for this program still. And all Clemson and Dabo Swinney have to do in 2025 is go out there and win games, starting with that first one.
This is arguably the biggest opener that Clemson has had in at least this decade. I mean, you could say, like, yeah, 2021 Georgia was big, but obviously that team wasn't very good in retrospect. The Clemson team wasn't very good in retrospect. But I think this one, from a national narrative standpoint,
yeah,
I don't think – I think it's massive, because you weren't the favorite last year to beat Georgia. You were double-digit underdogs. Like we said going into that game, like, that this was not going to define your season. I do think that this game could potentially define your season, or maybe not define your season, but define how you're viewed
from a national perspective. Yes, absolutely.
And so, yeah, I mean, that's, and from a recruiting standpoint, you're at home, and if you lose this game, that's 2 straight losses at home. If you date back to last year, because you lost to South Carolina, so like that would put a pretty big damper. I mean, and like I said, it wouldn't end your season, and all your goals would still be in front of you. But now nobody's going to have any respect for anything you do within the ACC. So, unless South Carolina is good again and you beat them, like that would be the only thing that would redeem you from a national perspective, because nobody thinks the ACC is any good. Even though I think this ACC schedule is not easy for Clemson this year.
No, it's not an easy schedule. There's some pitfalls that we already talked about when we kind of broke down the schedule a couple weeks ago. But yeah, I mean, from a national perspective, I think you're right. This game couldn't be any bigger, and I think you need to win it, convincingly. The only way to start turning some of the opinions when it comes to the national media on Clemson is you got to go in there and assert your will against a team like LSU on national television, because it's going to be a huge buildup. It's going to be built up, and you go out there and you assert your dominance against a team like that. That will start to. It won't completely, but it will start to turn the tide when it comes to the opinions of the national media and national college football fans as a whole. Tons of time between now and then for things to continue to trend in a positive direction, or for other things to happen as well. So we'll see how it goes. It's a long off season, unfortunately.